Well, welcome everyone. We're here to celebrate the Korea Foundation, and in particular to celebrate discuss the formation of the next generation programs, which are aimed at providing an avenue to get young scholars, young journalists, young people who are interested in helping to better relations with Korea, providing them an avenue forward in order ways to do that. We started in the United States about 8 years ago, and it's now gone global. So we're here to discuss this program with three wonderful members of those programs. First is Bridget Coggins, a professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara in political science. Then we have Professor Nishino, who is a professor at Keio University and helps to run the Japanese side of the program. And then Professor Pacheco Pardo from King's College in London, and he is also the Korea Foundation VUB chair at the Institute of European Studies. Let me give you a little bit of an overview of this next generation program because we're really proud of it. And in fact, at the Korean Studies Institute at USC, it's one of our most enjoyable, most rewarding programs that we've done over the years. We began, Victor Cha and I, who's at Georgetown, along with Gordon Flake at the Mansfield Institute, founded the first Next Gen program back in 2013, which was aimed at bringing young American scholars into U.S.-Korea relations more actively. We realized that there really weren't a whole lot of people behind us when we looked at who might write about and help influence how Americans and Koreans interact with each other of young scholars. It's been incredibly rewarding. We've reached out interdisciplinary. We have historians, professors of Korean literature, because in many ways this isn't just about policy. It's also about being a public intellectual. Newspapers, universities, people want to understand when something goes on in Korea. So we're not just focused on politics per se, but we want to get anyone who has knowledge and has devoted their life to studying Korea, help them learn to be public intellectuals, help them learn to influence the public debate. So we started, we're very proud of that. Since then, there was a new program organized for Asia experts run by the National Bureau of Asian Research, Mansfield Foundation. There's now a program for journalists run out of the Atlantic Council. And then by now we have about 70 young scholars or journalists a year participating in the program. In 2015, then Korea Foundation began to expand globally. So now there's London, covering all of Europe, organized by Chatham House. Thailand, or looking at ASEAN, organized by ISIS Thailand. Australia, in Japan by Japanese Institute of International Affairs and Keio. In China by Beta, Beijing University, in Russia, and then in India. So we have a number of different programs around the world that are aimed at increasing just better relations of Korea with all these countries. We have three wonderful scholars who have been instrumental in these, and we're going to ask them all to talk about 3 or 4 minutes about their experiences. And then we will go from there and just have a nice conversation about what this has meant and where it might be going in the future. So first, we're going to ask Bridget, can you, Professor Coggins, give us some thoughts about your experiences in the Next Gen program?
Sure. Well, I started as a participant in the Next Gen, and I was interested in Korea and especially security issues that were related to Korea. And I had lived there for a while in Seoul, but I couldn't have imagined the really high level access and expert training that I received through the Next Gen program. We went to Seoul to meet diplomats and decision makers. We went to Washington, D.C. To meet them in the United States. We went to Los Angeles in order to get really high level expert media training and be vetted by them. And so it was an incredibly valuable process for me to learn more about Korea myself, but also to engage with important people that are a part of the everyday and high-level politics between the two countries. Now I'm on the senior advisory board of the Next Gen program, and I take a really keen interest in the young scholars, but especially the young female scholars, and helping them to just have a female mentor in the field, which is something that is always an issue when it comes to academia, but also to help them to vet their books and read their op-eds and help them to figure out how to place and network with a community of true experts, right? Not just talking heads when it comes to Korea-US relations.
That was great. In fact, Bridget's video, we do videos from each of the young scholars, and Bridget's video. Let's go to Japan, and Professor Nishino, give us some discussion of your experiences with the program.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this session. So Keio University established the Center for Contemporary Korean Studies in 2009, and since then, our center developed various activities to foster Korean studies in Japan and to be a hub of network of Korean studies in the world. So as one of our activities, our center had started this program in 2018. And then I and the Korea Foundation co-organized various programs. And one of important aspect of this program is that bringing the young scholars in Japan, especially on the international relations in East Asia, to Seoul, and they can directly hear various voices in Korean society and the Korean policy expert. Then this definitely contributes to deepening understanding Korea for the Japanese young scholars. So I really appreciate the deep support of Korea Foundation to this program. Thank you.
Professor Pardo, what's the experience in Europe like?
So in our case, I think the program plays a crucial role because I would say that the interest in East Asia in general and in Korea in particular is not as high as it is in the US or Japan, obviously, which is in the region. So what we see normally, and my experience was that when I attended the program, in my case, I had been living in Korea a couple of times in Seoul as a student, as an undergrad, and as a PhD student. But most of my colleagues, they actually had experiences in other places in the region, not necessarily in Korea. And on top of that, the research interest might be more related to other countries in the region. So what I've noticed during my program, but then the two subsequent programs that have taken place that I attended to mentor some of the younger scholars, this program serves as a very good introduction about South Korea, North Korea, inter-Korean issues. This doesn't mean that those who attend, who is a mixture of academics, journalists, researchers at think tanks, haven't heard about these issues, but they give a deep dive that maybe is absent in Europe from the more general conversation. So you would get scholars coming from Korea to London to discuss these matters. You will have some European experts who will also talk about this, bringing the European perspective as well. And then when you go to Seoul, obviously you have the opportunity to meet with policymakers. You have the opportunity to do several visits. You go to the National Assembly as well. For example, so you have this set of visits that for many of the participants in the program, this is actually the first time that they meet these South Koreans who are in many different roles, right? In the past, they might have been an academic, for example, a researcher in a think tank, but they haven't met the people who are actually making policy. And that's what the program helps with. And I would add a second aspect to it, and I would emphasize this, that in Europe, and I guess it's the same in the US, in Japan, the program is not only about North Korea. And I say this because in Europe, when we discuss Korea in the media, now obviously we discuss K-pop, we discuss all these other matters, but when it comes to politics, security is always the North Korean nuclear issue, right? And it's actually only the nuclear issue, not even anything else about North Korea.
Yeah.
So the program is very helpful in discussing A, South Korea, B, other matters that are of importance in North Korea, not only the nuclear issue, and C, I would add the Europe-Korea dimension. It has strengthened dramatically over the last 10 years. This is the 10th anniversary of our strategic partnership, the European Union and South Korea, and that's not necessarily widely known even among the research community in Europe. So there is that third component that I think is very important for the European leg of the Next Generation program.
I mean, it's interesting because in some ways we are, after the initial stage of widening out Next Gen or implementing Next Gen around the world, right? Everybody's done a couple of these groups. Even the US, we're only fourth group in, 8 years in. I wonder if any of you, all of you would have interest in what are the biggest challenges that we face as taking this group and moving it forward, whether it's lack of interest, lack of funding, or issues, or we should feel free to just have a roundtable conversation about this now. So, I mean, what do you think are the biggest issues that you're facing in your various regions?
I would say that in Europe is what I mentioned, that sometimes the expertise is not there. So you have to build the expertise, right? And it's interesting because now when you see younger scholars coming through, the knowledge that they have about Korean Peninsula, I'm not going to say South Korea in this case, but Korean Peninsula, other than the nuclear issue, it is true that they know more about the culture because it has become very popular in Europe. But what about the politics? What about the economics? What about the security? And what about the relationship between Europe and Korea? But also in Europe, there is an increasing discussion about can we have trilateral discussions together with the US on Korean Peninsula issues? How do we approach relations with Korea in the context of also relations with Japan and China, right? The two other big players in the region. And that's something that is starting to come through, that it has been a challenge to bring it to the table. But I think through the program and through other discussions taking place in other forums, it's starting to be discussed. And that's quite important because for the next generation, some of them will go into academia, obviously, and the think tank community. But as I said, we also have people who come from journalism, so they will be reporting about the region, right? And when they're reporting about the region, in Europe traditionally the region was reported from Hong Kong, now maybe from mainland China, right? It wasn't reported from the other places in the region. So there is a slight slant, right? Seeing the region through a Chinese perspective, so to speak, right? And this has started to change, but I think this is talking about challenges. Maybe this is the challenge that we still not need to overcome fully.
It's interesting that Professor Pardo says that lack of expertise is a problem, because in the United States, I'm not sure if I would get in anymore to the Next Gen program, because the young scholars and experts that are involved now are, I think, several notches above where we were in the beginning, and they're incredibly impressive. They're publishing in venues like the New York Times and Washington Post, and are very engaged with policy in a way that I think we were in awe of in the earlier years. So I would say that in terms of challenges, it's making sure that there's enough capacity to meet the demand, because I think that U.S.-Korea relations are especially on everyone's mind right now, not just in security, which is my area of expertise, but on a number of different dimensions. Korea is very important to Americans, and we need a greater number of experts that are out there and with true expertise talking to the publics to make them better informed.
So in case of Japan, actually many participants are relatively well known about Korea, because so Korea is our neighboring country, and clearly Korea is a very important piece of Japan's diplomacy and foreign policy. But despite of the current difficult situation in Japan-ROK relationship, So one of the biggest challenge for me and to our program is to, in a way, overcome the negative stereotype image. So the Japanese media tended to deliver only negative aspects of our difficult relationship, given this difficult situation caused by the history issue. So under this condition, to continue this program, the overcoming this negative atmosphere in Japanese society is quite important for our center.
You know, I think that's a great point, Professor Nishino. I mean, and it goes with what Professor Coggins was saying, which is like one thing I find appalling about American media is the obsession with negative news, right? It just is obsession with negative news, and particularly with Korea, an almost unwillingness to take advantage of people who know something, right? So Kim Jong-un doesn't appear for 3 weeks, and the media goes berserk talking about he's dead. No matter how much we try and raise our hand and say, I don't think so, right? It's overwhelming. I mean, the need to have calm people who can talk about, sometimes there are bad things, right? Japan-Korea relations could be going better. But having the expertise and then being able to get the expertise, even just to the regular public, much less the policymakers, is a real issue. I mean, these are not minor things. These are fundamental things that I think frame the relationship between all of the countries that we're talking about, right? I think that's a great point, Professor Nishino, right? Like, I'm glad that we have more expertise in the U.S. And it's true, man, the fluency just in language of the younger generation, the bilingual, just comfort with language is, unthinkable at my generation, basically, right? I mean, it's just, they're so much better. And yet to me, this program, the biggest challenge is getting the expertise to where it matters, because half the time people don't want to hear. They'd prefer, policymakers or the media, if we talk about those two, are more interested in confirming their negative bias than they are in actually learning something, right? I also wonder, what would you say is the next step for each of the programs? Where would you say is the next thing you wanted? Is it steady state? Are your programs basically okay? Or where are you, what do you think is the next way to build in terms of the programs? Anybody, maybe Professor Nishino, what are you looking to expand on next?
So unfortunately, in case of this year, we cannot deliver our program because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But instead, our center conducted, in a way, follow-up seminar, which means that participants in 2018 and 19 jointly organized seminar. And we invited scholars from South Korea, and we discussed various issues, mainly foreign and security topic, to foster the network between Japanese and South Korean younger scholars. This is a quite important next step to continue to expand Korea study community.
Professor Pardo?
Yes, I think in the case of Europe, there are two aspects to it. So the first aspect is something that was done in the past, was very useful, right? They had this meeting in Seoul. We had this meeting in Seoul with participants from the US, as I recall, and Australia, I think, was the other country, right? And from a European perspective, that's always very useful in the sense that maybe we are isolated, detached from discussions taking place in other countries, and there's more communication, obviously, between the US and Japan and China on Korean matters. I'm talking about in Australia as well, is closer to the region and more involved in debates that take place in the region. There are more mutual visits, and in Europe, this is something that is has started. So there are mutual visits, but far less. And I wouldn't say that there's no understanding of the debate in other places, because the US debate, thanks to media, it gets to Europe. But for example, what may be Japan's position on Korean matters. One may be Australian position on Korean matters. That's something that we are detached from. We don't have access to that information. So this type of meetings, like the one we had in Seoul, was extremely useful. And I remember, all my European colleagues said, well, it was incredible to be able to discuss. I think it was for a couple of days, in breakout sessions, in the main panel session that we have, Korean matters, right? And it was actually Korean matters, so we didn't have to discuss China once more, which is what we discuss in Europe most of the time, right? So that's one aspect to it. And I think the second aspect that I noticed, yes, exactly. that's what I thought. And the second aspect to it is something that these other programs are doing, right, which is trying to place op-eds, trying to publish in the maybe the more popular media, not necessarily in an academic journal. And we haven't reached that level in Europe yet. So, I would agree with the point that the younger scholars coming up, I wouldn't say they're maybe at the same level as they're in the US right now, but it's true that in terms of language skills, there has been an improvement clearly. There has also been an improvement in terms of, having been in the country, for example, only 6 months, 1 year as an undergrad exchange student, right? So they have the knowledge. So how do we help them place op-eds, be interviewed by media, because they are the true experts on Korea matters, as opposed to something that I think we still have in Europe, which is, I'm an Asia expert, right? So I can talk about India, I can talk about China, but I can also talk about K-pop and North Korea, right? And that still happens in Europe, less and less, I have to say, less and less, but it still happens, right? And I think the challenge is placing these younger people to make sure that they can, provide an adequate analysis of what is going on in the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah. Bridget, what do you think as a senior advisor?
Well, I have two thoughts, and they're ideas. We did have there was some talk about there being a next gen multi-program reunion.
Yes.
And I think that would be a fabulous initiative to get the continents and countries talking to one another about their programs and engaging on substantive issues on Korea. But also meeting each other and starting to network to form more durable bonds across countries for those of us who have been exposed to the program and benefited from Korea Foundation's initiative. So that's my first proposal. I think that would be a fabulous idea. The second is that we have so many fabulous technical experts. During my program, there's a person who had expertise in environmental issues. We recently had a next gen person who was looking at educational issues, and especially cheating and things like that, which are big hot topics in both the United States and Korea right now. And so I wonder if there would be interest and the ability to kind of start specialized, maybe a science next gen, or that was maybe working on environmental issues, or an education next gen. I don't know if there's sufficient interest, but I think that could be an incredibly valuable way to make sure that people are starting to engage with experts in their specific field. For me, the program as it is right now was very, very valuable because I'm interested in diplomacy and politics and security issues. But I can see that as the program develops, that it might become more specialized, and that might be very valuable for inter-Korean relations.
I like all Korean relations, and especially the idea of like bringing the various countries together would be awesome. It'd be super fun to have the junior scholars from all these various places network with each other here, as well as just with Korea, right? More of a network rather than a hub and spokes. And I like the idea of specialization as well. Like we've worked really hard on the US one to move beyond just politics and diplomacy. We really wanted literature, humanities, history, sociology. And it's fabulous to get their perspectives. And then if we can do some of those and then as well have some that also are just general where we all get to know each other, I think might be a really good way forward, right? I think some of this is really interesting because with COVID, for the next, whatever it is going to be, 6 months or whatever, a year, until we actually have a handle on this thing. I think we're all sort of paused. Our fourth version was supposed to start this January in DC, and we're still not sure, whether it makes sense to move forward with some virtual thing when the whole value of this is we get together for like 3 days, talk to each other, and visit the National Security Council and visit the White House. And so, we may have to pause for a while, in which case maybe some of these virtual things could get people together in around the world. I mean, I think that's a good idea. We should try and follow up on that, right? As long as I'm not up at 7 a.m. every day. But I like this idea. If you guys are interested, we'll try and follow up. We're almost out of time, I think, because we need to have make this short and sharp. But I wonder, does anyone have any either parting thoughts they wanted to get out about, things that could be improved, or just some general thoughts about the program? We want to go around one last time before we say goodbye? Why don't we go in reverse order? Let's start with Europe this time.
I think for Europe, to be honest, this has been a game changer. Even if you look at our universities, think tanks, yes, we do have growing expertise on Asia, but I go back to when I was hired at King's 10 years ago, and I was one of 2 Asia people, right? And again, I mentioned this, I was not a Korea person, I was an Asia person, right? Anything goes, right? So this has thankfully changed, but in terms of expertise about Korea itself, without the program, it would have been difficult to build this. Obviously, it comes together with the Coreacheer, the professorships, etc., etc. So it has really been a game changer. And as I said before, now the younger generation, they have more expertise, but I think there's also more expertise because there is more interest, because there are the positions there, right? So you can see, okay, I have a career path that is related to Korea, as opposed to, which is not uncommon in Europe, as opposed to doing China and I do Korea on the side, or I do China and Japan on the side, which also happens in Europe, right? So I have the career path working on Korea, and something I think Bridget, you said before, right? Or maybe it's you, David, right? The fact that there are people who work on literature, who work on cinema, who work on culture as well, right? And this is started to feed into Europe because there is the demand there. It's starting to fit into the program. I would say in Europe, the program is still very much politics, security-oriented. Obviously, economics is important as well. But it's started to fit. You start to see in the virtual meeting that we had earlier this year, because you couldn't have it face-to-face, there were younger next generation scholars who didn't come from the social sciences specifically, right? They come from the arts and humanities, so they come with another angle. And I agree. That's really great to see. So in a sense, thanks to the program, this is being built in a way that I think without the program, maybe the impetus would have not been there and would have been much slower. Great.
How about Professor Nishino?
Yeah. So again, in case of Japan, actually, at this moment, so deepening the understanding of Korean society is quite important, not only for Japanese scholars, but also all of Japanese. So in this context, I want to emphasize that in this program, so the listen from both the conservative and the progressive side of Korean society is quite important. So fortunately and generously for the support of Korean Foundation, we could realize this kind of activities. So to listen from both progressive side and the conservative side, now we can establish a very balanced view toward Korean society. So I want to continue to put the importance of this aspect. Thank you.
Great. Bridget, for the final parting shot.
I don't know how often people watch television or pay attention to talking heads in the United States, but if you look around, what you'll see is that there are still a lot of very misinformed ideas about Korea in the United States with respect to the alliance, with respect to security issues, with respect to economic issues. And so I think that while I want to thank the Korea Foundation definitely for continuing to support the program, this is a critical time for U.S.-Korea relations, and I want to reemphasize that it's, maybe double down, because there's going to be there are so many things that are in flux right now with respect to U.S.-Korea. And I think that it's more important than ever to have informed people that are out there and are at least knocking at the door and trying to be heard and give real expertise, real substantive expertise on the issues that we face. We're longtime friends and allies, and it's important to have people explain the stakes and what it is that needs to happen and should happen going forward.
That's a really good reminder as we close this panel, how important our role is in every one of these countries to help guide good relations to hopefully better, more stable relations around the world, right? So thank you, Korea Foundation, for funding us. Keep funding us. Thanks particularly to the professors here, Professors Coggins, Nishino, and Pardo. I think this has been really useful, and we hope to see all of you again, either here or in Seoul. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.